Hello and welcome to How Learning and Development Can Be Used to Champion DEI. My name is Maddie Christopher, I'm Deputy Editor of HR Zone and I'll be your presenter for this webinar, brought to you by HR Zone in association with Thrive. In this session, we'll be examining DEI's role in L&D and how to make sure your L&D offerings are truly inclusive. Now to introduce our expert panel for this session. We have Nathan Nalla, founder and director of Be the Riot, and Helen Marshall, head of learning at Thrive. Thank you both for joining us. Just a bit of housekeeping. The group chat function is available to say hello. Please share thoughts, ask questions, and get involved. Please send any questions you have as we go along by posting them in the group chat, as we'll have 15 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. You'll get a copy of the recording sent to you shortly after the session, so you can watch on demand in your own time. Over to you, Nathan and Helen.
Thank you, Maddie. My name is Helen Marshall, as Maddie just said, and I'm Head of Learning at Thrive. I'm really pleased to be here and to be taking part in this conversation, and we want it to be just that, so a conversation. So please do use the chat and say hi and get involved that way. I'm, as I mentioned, Head of Learning, so my role is quite multifaceted across Thrive, but for those who don't know who we are, we're a learning and skills platform. We also have our wonderful content club, and our data lab service as well. And we're really invested in thinking about people's experience of learning and the content that they access and developing themselves as individuals. And aside from that, I'm also interested in creating more inclusive spaces and thinking about how people can join in that conversation and what things we need to do within our own organisations and beyond to drive this conversation forward. So really pleased to be here. And I'll pass over to Nathan to do a quick intro as well.
Nathan, you're on mute.
Great start. So yeah, my name is Nathan Nalla. I'm the founder and director of Be the Riot, as Maddie said. And day to day, my work involves supporting organizations to create inclusive workplace culture. One of the ways we do that is through sort of helping to develop and deliver and facilitate learning content that focuses on equity, diversity, and inclusion. As well as supporting organizations to understand some of the experiences that their employees have in relation to EDI and how this sort of understanding can translate into strategy building. So how can we embed EDI principles in wider strategy? So that's just a little bit about me and the work of Be the Riot. I'm really happy to be here today and to have this conversation.
I think that's a really nice way into our first question as well, Nathan. So just so you know, we've set each other kind of questions so we can bounce these ideas around and think about these different directions that we're all taking within our organisations and the organisations we're supporting. So we know that a lot of you will be on at different stages of this journey. So please do use the chat function. So we'll pop a question in there, and that is, what key tips would you give to people or to an L&D lead to get started in developing DE&I learning within their organisation? So I'm sure people have tips to share, but Nathan, over to you to give us the kind of first hot take on that.
Yeah, so my thinking around this is, I guess in doing this work, I've seen organizations often taking perhaps a bit more of a generic approach to EDI. And so there's a lot of sort of standardized off-the-shelf content that you might see, and often these might be sort of fairly generic e-learning modules that sort of get blasted to everyone within the organization. And once, you know, you've completed it, a box is ticked to say that, yes, you've done it, you've done this course. And the challenge that I have with that is that the work around equity, diversity, and inclusion is really more about culture change. And so oftentimes those generic off-the-shelf bits of content don't necessarily sort of lead to sort of making an impact that then leads to that culture change. I think organizations or L&D leads that are thinking about doing sort of putting a learning program together for EDI really need to first think about some of the specific challenges that exist within their organization. There are, of course, you know, challenges that we see within society, and these give us sort of a clear sort of indication of what might be happening within our organizations. But every organizational culture is different. And so there may be challenges that you face that other organizations don't. And so it means sort of doing a bit of work. And so for me, it's about asking the question, you know, what are the experiences that our employees are having? And of course, extending that as well to think about other people that might interact with your organization. So consumers, service users, so on. What are some of the experiences that they're having? And then on the other side, thinking about the knowledge piece, right? So what is it where are the knowledge gaps within our workforce? What are some of the things that our people really need to understand about EDI? And so, you know, I've seen some organizations take different approaches with this. One of the obvious things to do is to roll out employee engagement surveys to find out more about people's experiences and how they feel about these subjects. And also things like focus groups, right? Having conversations with people to get a sense of some of the challenges that they might face. And I know sometimes I'll say EDI, sometimes I'll say DEIE. There are different sort of acronyms, but it's all the same thing. But what we're talking about is, you know, it's broad, and we should think about diversity in its broadest sense. So I guess, and before I hand back over to Helen for some of her tips, just thinking about what we mean when we say diversity, inclusion, equity. It's not, of course, just about gender. It's not, of course, just about race or sexual orientation, but there are a wide range of other aspects that are sort of key to a person's identity or relate to a person's background, circumstance, that can have an impact on how they navigate the workplace and perhaps mean that they might encounter certain barriers, right? So often missing from the conversation is disability and ableism, right? Or neurodiversity, or even social economic background, religion and belief. There are so many different facets to diversity that we need to be considering when we're thinking about building content as well. I'll stop there. Pass over to Helen. There's more that I could say on this though.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. And I think that really underscores the direction I probably wanted to head in as well with this question, in that I think there's always going to be, you're going to be at some point in a journey into kind of DE&I. So you might just be starting out, you might, you know, have been thinking about these things for a while, but there's so many different elements to think about that fall under a potential strategy that you're never going to be able to do everything all at once. So my advice would be thinking about where you are as an organization and what you're hoping to achieve, what your current workforce saying, what do they need, how can you support them, but then also think about your wider business goals and your objectives in terms of whether DE&I forms part of that or not, and whether it should be the focus for your organization. And I think I guess one thing I've been talking to people recently about is that DEI it's not competition. So there's going to be some organizations that are out there saying, like, we're the best at doing this, we're championing X, Y, and Z, and that's brilliant. And if that's having a lasting impact, that's great. And even just having that conversation is, you know, a brilliant place to start. But you know, even if you're not doing things loudly, as long as you're doing things right, you know, that's the main thing. And it's not a race to a finish line. There's always going to be work to do. So it's thinking both short term and long term about what you want to achieve. So yeah, there's probably some things that you can do in the next couple of months. But then what are we looking at further down the line? And if we're having this conversation again in 2 years' time, where do you hope to be? And I think that can really help frame that conversation and what your priority areas should be. And I think when I've spoken to a lot of our clients who are invested in diversity and equity, they, particularly from a content club perspective, so like you say, there's that offering of here's content to support you on this journey. One of the ways that I frame that is, well, we've got all of this content, but there's no point just throwing it at people. You need to be more strategic about how you're using it, and it needs to form part of a much bigger plan. It's not it might be a starting point, but it's definitely not going to be the end point. So I think that's really where I'd head with those kind of starting points. And I guess we can dig into that stuff around e-learning modules and recognizing that it's not just about providing e-learning on race or sexuality or discrimination. It's the conversation should be much wider than that as well.
Yeah, it's about addressing the specific challenges of your organization for me. So I definitely agree with all that you've said, Helen. And of course, e-learning has its place, and it's a really valuable tool within learning, especially within larger organizations, right, where we need to make sure every single person has access to specific content. Maybe less feasible to do that in other ways. But what I have, I guess, seen time and time again is where, you're presenting people with, the Equality Act and listing out the protected characteristics and saying to people, make sure you don't discriminate. And I'm just, not 100% convinced that necessarily leads to the type of culture change that we want to see within organizations. And I guess just to give an example as well of really tapping into, I guess, the nuance of certain challenges that might be experienced within your organization. An organization that I worked with actually spoke about sort of getting feedback from employees prior to building out sort of learning and development content for EDI. And one of the findings that came out of their sort of surveys was that employees had actually experienced racial discrimination at the hands of service users. And so they recognized that this was a challenge that actually they wanted to address through their learning content, right? And so oftentimes, perhaps something more generic isn't going to get into the ins and outs of, okay, as an individual, as an employee, here is what we expect you to do in those moments. If you're a colleague and you're seeing another, one of your colleagues experience something like this, this is how we expect you to respond. As a manager, this is how we expect you to respond. So it's really digging deep and addressing the specific issues of your organization, equipping people with the tools to handle certain situations as they do come up. And then the final point that I'll just add, which touches on what you were saying, Helen, about this, needing to not just be short-term goals, but really thinking about the long-term. And so I think that's a real challenge, because often what I've seen as well in doing this work is that from the top, there's often a pressure, right, to get this EDI thing done. And sometimes there's a bit of a false expectation that's set. And it's, if we roll out this one piece of learning content, then all of our challenges relating to EDI are going to go away. Or, maybe we'll have a 6-month plan, and then by the end of that 6-month plan, we can switch priorities and now start focusing on another aspect of organizational priority. And unfortunately, that's simply not how EDI works and how culture change works. And so I often speak about how, we've seen a number of these challenges existing within our society for decades, for centuries, right? The issue of racism isn't new. Issue of sexism isn't new. Issues of homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, ableism, all of these things, they're not new. And actually, they, aren't going to go away overnight, but there are things that we can do to continually work towards addressing them and stamping them out within the cultures within our organizations. So perhaps that actually is a nice segue to the next question, which is, how can professionals keep up to date with the evolving world of DEI in learning and development? So I'll let you sort of go first, Helen, and then I'll come back.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. Yeah, thanks for that insight as well. I think I suppose L&D has been notoriously slow in making change, I think. And so we have a responsibility, I think, as an industry to, I guess, do better and be better, and not be responsible for saying that our training is the solution to these issues, because, as you say, things can run deeper than, will always run deeper than just here's a piece of training, and if you've done it, you're therefore going to be, better equipped to deal with a certain situation. So I think it's recognizing that things change quite rapidly within the DEI landscape, and it's making use of your network. So for me, that is, and this might sound quite obvious, but it's keeping in touch with people on LinkedIn. It's following the right people and thinking about what information they're sharing, what conversations they're part of. And I know you mentioned neurodiversity at the beginning of the conversation, Nathan, and that's something that I've seen being spoken about so much more on LinkedIn recently. And I suppose that kind of stems from dyslexic thinking being made a recognized superpower, a skill on LinkedIn, and rightly so. So it can help you figure out what's relevant within the industry at the time. You do have to be a little bit careful about some of the stuff that people are sharing, as you probably know, if you do use the platform. It's almost like vetting things for their authority before you think, oh, I've seen this great thing, I'm going to share it with my network. But also getting the right voices involved and recognizing who those voices are and looking at the research that they're conducting, and kind of, I suppose, going down a bit of a rabbit hole in terms of that research and the conversations that they're having and those events that they're part of. And we all know that L&D love a conference and love an event, and there are constant events that are going on, webinars that are going on throughout the year that you can be part of, and you can, like this one, obviously, where you can dip in and out of and see what people are talking about, what kind of hot topics people are discussing, and making it more than a hot topic. So kind of kicked myself when I said that out loud just then, because it's not just a hot topic. It is something that needs to be embedded across most elements of an organization. So I think it's, thinking about that wider picture, what people are talking about, getting the right voices involved, recognizing the right voices. There's always going to be the big guns like McKinsey who are pushing out major pieces of research. And for those who haven't heard of Red Thread Research, I really like the way that they're headed with research in the L&D space. So take a look at them as well and see if there's anything that resonates with you there. And they have just released a piece on DE&I, I think. It is a paid service, so obviously that does provide a barrier to some people. But it is also really good and high quality research. So I think it's, to summarize all those points, just keeping in touch with what's going on in your network, making a network for yourself, and being part of that conversation as well, and keeping an ear to the ground in that way. And Nathan, I know you're going to have a different take to this as well, because I know LinkedIn isn't your go-to answer for most things. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Well, yeah, no, I definitely agree. It's important to be connected with those networks and and actually broaden those networks and hear various different sort of ideas and, get a bit more exposure to certain lived experiences that you might not otherwise. I think oftentimes what we find, especially if your organization is a larger one, there will be people within the organization who have a passion for EDI. Oftentimes it might be because of their own lived experience. And I think even though, having lived experience doesn't make you, the leading voice on a topic, right? It's a nice, often a nice place to start. And it can be a helpful place to start in sort of recognizing some of the challenges that people face. So within your organization, if you have an inclusion committee, or you have, employee resource groups or affinity groups, so on, these might be great places to start to, sense check some of your thoughts and ideas and actually really the approach that you want to take with this kind of learning is perhaps a more collaborative approach anyway, right? And getting other people to share their thoughts and ideas and things that they've perhaps seen work well in other organizations. And that doesn't need to be a sort of one-time process. I think it's really crucial that even sort of once content has been rolled out, that you're continuing to collect feedback, and, you know, really check things for cultural sensitivity, check that, you know, the language is appropriate. This is something that comes up a lot actually with the different organizations that I work with. Language, because language has changed so much over the last few years in relation to this specific topic. And there are new terms that people aren't sort of familiar with that do come up. And, you know, previous terms that we were used to hearing or using are no longer acceptable. So one of the examples is, you know, BAME or BAME, which is a term that we were constantly hearing, right? And so many people who would be put in the BAME category were like, no, I don't like this term, and I'm never going to use this term to describe my own identity. And then it turned out, I think it was at the start of this year, that the government said that they weren't going to be using that term again. And so oftentimes organizations are like, so what do we say instead? So like, how do we navigate this? And so there are these things that are constantly changing. I don't think the language that we use around EDI is perfect. And I say that a lot. And actually what I've seen organizations do, and actually support organizations with, is creating sort of tools. So like glossary tools, or almost like live language toolkits. And so that people within the organization can access these and also, you know, provide feedback. They can, you know, go in and sort of update and edit them as things do progress and change over time. And it also means that you have sort of a key language within your organization. But yeah, the landscape is often changing. And so finding those networks and finding sort of useful tools that you can put together or create to help people across the organization is really valuable.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Nathan. So I guess part of the problem that we've already identified is this idea of content or resources being kind of pushed out and forced onto people. One of those things, and I think this kind of links in with the changing terminology as well that you were just discussing, is that one of those things was unconscious bias training. So I think we've probably all, you know, seen some sort of unconscious bias training. We've all maybe got some in our content catalogs. And whilst I think it's really useful in some respects to help you kind of reframe your way of thinking or the ideas that you might, you know, by nature have, it's not the answer for a lot of things. And I'd love to hear why it's not the answer. Why do you think it's not the answer?
Yeah, I think one of the issues with it is that we set the wrong expectations, right? And so one of the criticisms that was made, again, the government, that they were saying they're no longer going to be rolling out unconscious bias training because it hasn't been proven that by rolling out unconscious bias training, your organization is going to become more diverse. And so that's true, right? It's true. And I think having the expectation that by rolling out a piece of training content, perhaps, you know, a 2-hour workshop, for example, again, is going to translate into a complete change within your organization. I think it's an unrealistic expectation to have from the beginning. It's not impossible to address unconscious bias. So, you know, the studies, research in this area is ongoing. And so there are a number of things that can be done to address unconscious bias. And one of them is that first step of acknowledging that, yes, it exists. Yes, we are all affected by it. But that's literally just the first step, right? Beyond that, of course, there are things that organizations can do, and we see this actually quite a lot, where we're removing the opportunity for unconscious bias to take place. So you might see that in things like anonymized job applications or CVs, where literally a person's name isn't visible. You're not going to get indications about their ethnic background, their gender, perhaps their age, perhaps, the area that they live in, their postcode. So there'll be certain things that are removed. Of course, this isn't the complete answer, because at some point that individual is going to turn up and they are going to have a face-to-face interaction or an interaction over Zoom, where all of these things do become visible. But then there are other things that can be done as well. And I think one of the challenges is that to really address unconscious bias, we have to take a personal approach. And so to give you an example, some of the research tells us that actually reducing unconscious biases, or let's say negative associations towards certain groups, means developing empathy and understanding for certain groups. How do we do that? We do that by building relationships, right? Building relationships with people who are different to ourselves. And oftentimes people don't want to step outside of their comfort zone and do that, right? But that's something that is actually proven to address some of those biases. Another thing is sort of actively seeking content that contradicts the sort of stereotypes that we often see in society. So for example, there's a lot of evidence that shows that people tend to have a negative association with women in leadership roles. And so if you were to take that point around proactively seeking out ways to address the unconscious bias, maybe it means listening to a podcast about great women business leaders, right? Or it's about reading a book about women in science, leading women in science. So it's like literally taking decisions that oppose the stereotypes and address some of those negative ideas that exist within our society. And there are other things that we can do, but of course, again, it comes down to the individual, often comes down to, things that organizations can put in place to help, but it doesn't necessarily address unconscious bias directly. So if you're an organization that are looking at unconscious bias, I would say that raising awareness is one piece, but then it's also about thinking about, how you're introducing these ways of working steps that actually aim to reduce or, cause people to really think about how their biases might be impacting the decisions that they're making and move from a place of unconscious bias to conscious inclusion. And, unconscious bias is just one topic within EDI. There are so many other aspects that we need to sort of understand, whether that's thinking about things like microaggressions, whether that's thinking about just some of the things that we can be doing, again, consciously doing to make people feel that sense of inclusion, no matter who they are within the organization. So I think it's, about moving away from that place of just awareness to some of those practical steps, but really being honest about what some of those practical steps are as well.
And microaggressions there, Nathan, that you just mentioned, that's one of the new terms that has kind of appeared over the past year or so, that I feel like it's in the circles that I move in and internally at Thrive, that is something that we know what it means, and we have an idea about how you can tackle microaggressions within the workplace. But actually, outside that bubble, it's not a term that a lot of people know, and it's still kind of the education piece there for how what that is, how you can recognize it, how you can take steps to help people who are facing microaggressions, both inside and outside work. So yeah, it was interesting that you mentioned that then, and I think you're completely right about that. Unconscious bias training often will use specific examples to kind of highlight your own unconscious bias. But what is more relevant to an organization is the point at which unconscious bias will start to play a part. So like you're saying, in hiring practices, for example, or in I don't know, if you're having if there's a piece of work that needs to be done and someone works on a flexible contract, for example, rather than a full-time employee, like does that then kind of impact the way that you think about assigning work on a project? And it's those kind of really that are in kind of focus are quite small decisions, but they actually can have a really big impact. So it's thinking about what those moments are going to be within the organization, and unconscious bias training can help frame some of those things, but it's never going to affect a change. Like you said, it's an awareness piece. It's not an answer. It's a like an information gathering tool, I suppose, to say like this is how you might be feeling, how you might be affected, but actually these are the points that in the organization that you might experience this, or you might expect to see someone experiencing this. And I guess it's just about identifying what those moments are and how we can work with people to change. It's a huge thing, isn't it? It's not just one. Unconscious bias can affect all different areas. So it's thinking about what that looks like again for an organization.
Yeah. And some of the solutions that I've seen organizations take, I guess going back to some of the research around addressing unconscious bias, one of the things that stood out to me is actually holding people to account. So when a person knows that at some point after they've made their decisions, there's going to be a conversation around whether that decision that they took was based on objective criteria or whether bias was an influence there. Just knowing that you're going to have that accountability has an impact on the decisions that you make, right? And so often what we find is that people slow down and people question themselves more. Is this the right decision? Am I basing this on the objective criteria, or are there other things perhaps influencing my feelings here? If I have two, we always talk about hiring, but I think it's a really sort of simple example to give. But if you have two candidates who are both equally capable of doing the role, but you're just, for whatever reason, drawn to one over the other, asking yourself the question, why is it that I'm drawn to this particular person over the other person? Maybe it is because of affinity bias. Maybe it is because we have more in common, right? And is that a fair assessment to make, or is that a fair basis to be hiring someone on? And so I've seen organizations literally include sort of almost like a few prompting questions for the interview panel around bias. So when they're having discussions about candidates, they're also asking each other, what biases may have come up for you with this particular candidate. And so just bringing some of that, what tends to be unconscious or implicit, to the forefront and getting people to consciously think about it can be a really sort of helpful tool. And yeah, you're right on the point on microaggressions. I didn't even, because I've been talking about them for so long, I often forget that there are a lot of people who probably haven't even heard that term before being used. But I think oftentimes what we see in the workplace is that sort of the more overt acts of discrimination or sort of overt sort of conflict or behaviors tend to be less common and perhaps easier to deal with. And it's more those behaviors, perhaps sometimes people might describe it as banter or jokes that have gone too far. Sometimes it might be in inappropriate questions being asked of a person about their cultural background, or assumptions being made, stereotyping people or devaluing a person based on a specific aspect of their identity. These interactions are more common than the overt sort of acts of discrimination. And so, yeah, there is a lot of sort of work around exploring these and finding ways to address them in the workplace, which for me, as I said, I think they are more tricky to deal with than the overt issues, because overt often means, there's sort of a clear-cut response It's, you know, this person said this thing, they've done this thing, it's obviously sexist or it's obviously racist or whatever, homophobic. HR can do something about that. But if someone asks a question and they say, well, actually, I was just asking that question out of curiosity, but that question was coming from a place of ignorance and actually caused offense to the person on the receiving end, how do you then navigate those interactions? What I find is that often people just sweep them under the rug because they are complex to deal with. People are like, I don't want to make a big deal or a big fuss out of it, but it did really make me feel uncomfortable. And so some of the work that I do when we're exploring microaggressions is how to have conversations with people about things that they've said or done that have caused offense or made people feel uncomfortable in a way that is less combative. And so, yeah, sort of exploring having some of those more challenging conversations, but doing so in a way that's really mature, really adult, really professional, and actually addresses the issue without necessarily demonizing the person who's expressed the behavior.
Yeah, I think it's quite challenging, Nathan, I imagine, for a lot of people to be in a situation where they've said something, it's gone too far, it's not the right thing to have said in that situation, and to be able to sit back and accept or acknowledge feedback that, you know, this wasn't the right thing to say, and I guess be the person that can just, you know, acknowledge that must be quite difficult. And like you say, it's about having those conversations in a less kind of confrontational way, I suppose. But they're definitely needed. And I think one thing that sprung to mind there and sorry, I am going off slightly on a tangent here, is the idea of allyship. Again, another word that has been kind of bandied about recently. And it's the idea of obviously being able to advocate for not advocate, but support other people who are experiencing discrimination, or, you know, being able to kind of stand up for people when it really matters. And I think there's like the whole idea about being an active ally rather than just saying you're an ally to someone. You're only an ally in the moments where it's needed. Otherwise, you know, you're not being an ally, you're just saying that you are. And that's something I think that, you know, is links into that idea of microaggressions as well, within the workplace. And if you see something that, you know, is clearly not right, that something has gone too far, something is continuously happening that isn't, you know, the right thing within a workplace, then standing up and saying something is really difficult, but actually experiencing it is going to be much worse. So being able to feel in a safe enough space within your organization to do that and know that you can help someone else, you know, is key. And being able to create those safe spaces to have conversations, even with people who, you know, might need some guidance for, you know, their behavior or the way that they approach conversations, I guess comes down to psychological safety a lot of the time as well, and being able to, you know, to challenge and to, you know, have a voice and be recognised in that, and not have your ideas kind of cast to one side, I suppose. But yeah, sorry, I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent there around allyship.
No, it's all really valuable, and I think it brings us to the next question, which is around some of the success that we've seen in different organizations, right? So what are some of the successful approaches that you've seen organizations take? I don't know if you want to go ahead and I can follow up.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think there's obviously a poll on the screen for anyone who wants to take part, and that's around, which links into this question, that's around whether DEI is seen as a vertical pillar within your organization or a horizontal stream. So by that, I think we mean DE&I can often be a content dump. It is just a one thing by itself. Here's all this content on all these different areas, and once you've done it all, that's great. You're now compliant in this. But by horizontal, which I think both agree is a much more, it's holistic. You're taking a view of DE&I across the organization. So it's interlinking with multiple different areas. So within recruitment, within that hiring process, within onboarding, within your professional reviews, performance reviews, your team meetings, your policies and procedures within an organization, within your exit interviews, and all that kind of survey and data information that gets gathered along that whole employee life cycle. So that's what we mean by the difference between vertical and horizontal. So it would be really interesting to hear how you're feeling about that. So I can see the results on screen now are showing that there's obviously a real mixture of approaches that are going on at the moment. So I think it's encouraging that so many people are recognizing it as horizontal and interlinking with all those areas like we've discussed, Nathan. But also, here we don't have any DE&I learning. So that's nearly 24% of people currently don't have anything. But I think, again, coming back and looping back around to what we said right at the start, being here and starting to be part of conversations and thinking about these practices is a way to start, thinking more deeply about what this looks like for your organization. And again, it's not necessarily a bad thing if your DE&I strategy is vertical, DE&I is vertical within your organization, that's a starting point. And I'm not saying that that's a terrible place to be. I think we just need to start thinking, like I said, more holistically about that experience. So, and interestingly, the clients that we work with, we're fortunate enough to work with so many kind of forward-thinking organizations that the ones we've seen that have most success when it comes to DE&I strategies are the ones who are making it part of a much longer term conversation. And it's great to have kind of awareness days and campaigns and celebrate things in that way, but there's a persistence in what some of our key clients are doing. So, for example, one of our customers, Lottoland, who I'm sure the name kind of is familiar to a lot of people on the webinar, that it is just fundamental to the setup of the organization that and voices are really championed across the organization to bring key conversation elements into focus. So they have kind of spotlights on key individuals who, like you say, have that lived experience, but and we're not kind of saying that those individuals are going to solve problems, but just instigating a conversation, or necessarily solve problems. They're going to be part of a conversation and highlight ideas and real stories that, this impacts me in this organization. This is how the organization supported me. These are the ideas that we're thinking about. And it really, at Lottoland, it's been really great to see that kind of take shape. And Sophie Wood is a driving force of that at Lottoland as well. So I'm sure if you are, again, on LinkedIn, you'll see her kind of popping up and around as well. But we have loads of clients that are doing similar things. So it's not just about, we're really focused on campaign driven learning at Thrive. It's a huge part of our platform. We know that it is a way to engage people, to get people talking about key subjects. But again, it's not the end point of what we're suggesting people do. It's a way to attract attention. It's a way to bring people into focus and key ideas. But it is that starting point. Excuse me, I'm going to cough. Sorry, it's a live webinar. So I think it's those conversations that are really, really important to have. So Dunelm, for example, are just starting out bringing a DEI focused team to work with their L&D function, and they've split it out within the organisation to make sure that it's embedded across everything that they're doing. So that will be seen across our platform and their platform use, but they again have recognised that need to interlink those conversations and encourage people to be connecting across different departments and different teams and sharing ideas and sharing stories and again, just linking it back into that lived experience. So Yeah, I've gone on for a little bit there. Nathan, do you have anything reflection on the poll that's on screen?
Yeah, and I'll be very brief because I know we want to get onto the Q&A segment as well. But I think, yeah, when I think about sort of the horizontal learning piece, I think oftentimes EDI can feel like this sort of extracurricular activity, and actually it's really about thinking about your organizational values and how EDI is really connected to your values and therefore all of the ways of working, right? And so I guess a good tip is looking at all of the learning content that exists within your organization and thinking about the ways that EDI principles can be weaved into these different sort of areas or, you know, modules that you might have. So a perfect example of that is recently working with an organization who have a sort of a learning program for new managers. And so as part of that learning program, we incorporated a module on inclusive leadership. So thinking about, you know, various different aspects of, or thinking about why inclusion is good for business or organizations, why diversity is good for business organizations. So really setting the tone there, but also getting individuals to think about their own leadership style and how it can be further sort of characterized or adapted to incorporate specific characteristics that center inclusive leadership. So things like collaboration, things like support, things like cultural intelligence. And so, you know, rather than having these standalone EDI modules, think about the different ways that you can incorporate into the learning content that already exists, whether that's recruitment, whether that's customer service, whether that's sales. You know, how does EDI relate to these different streams, and what is it that we want our people to understand and be doing differently based on these principles? So I'll stop there because I know we've got a few questions for the Q&A. Maddie, I don't know if you want to host some of the questions.
Absolutely. Yeah, so if people can start popping their questions in now, that would be great. We do have a question already. A couple of people have been asking about resources. Can you recommend, so Naomi's asked about a glossary tool, which Laura has kindly put in the chat, but it's a great question to address, like where's a good place to find good resources?
So yeah, I think it's quite difficult to find, or at least I haven't come across a tool that looks at all different areas of diversity. But what you will find is that there are some sort of very specific tools within certain areas. So for example, LGBTQ plus identities, within that, if you look at Stonewall's website, I know that they have a glossary that goes into quite a bit of depth and, you know, loads of different terms on there. I've seen, I'm going to forget the name of the organization now, but I've seen another organization that have sort of a language tool around neurodiversity. I haven't yet come across an organization that has everything. But also, we at Be the Riot have our own glossary. I wouldn't say that it covers all of the different aspects of diversity in detail, but it is definitely a great starting point. So yeah, Stonewall have their own glossary that focuses on LGBTQ plus identities and of course language surrounding that. But if anyone is interested in the Be the Riot glossary, I can definitely share that with you.
Yeah, and I was going to say similar thing, Nathan. I always look to charities as well to see how they're framing ideas and where they're drawing their information from. So again, it's, you know, something to think about when you're looking for resources.
Great. Robin asks, can you please advise how marketing departments can bring DEI into their L&D so that they are creating inclusive communications? Helen, do you want to start off with that one?
Yeah, again, I think it's down to recognizing who are the people that you're trying to communicate with. So, and everyone is going to be different. So I think it's thinking about, well, like I said, who they are, but what the story is that you're trying to tell with, whatever it is that you're marketing. Can you offer, I suppose, can you practice what you preach there and offer things in alternative formats as well? So if people actually need to access information in different ways, then you're able to do that. And it could be as simple as thinking about the type of, well, as Nathan mentioned earlier, the type of language that you're using, whether you're using the right terms, the right tone, and even the right imagery in what you're suggesting there. But also tying it into those bigger picture things. So if you're thinking about like marketing your the initiatives that you're running within an organization, then make sure you've got a campaign plan across a certain amount of time, and linking it into those key initiatives. So it's not just linking it into the initiatives that are running and the awareness days that are going on, but thinking about, well, yes, we're going to look at that, but then what do we do for those moments afterwards? So thinking about that campaign plan, I think, is probably quite a key focus there. And yeah, language, imagery, accessibility for people. So I guess there's two sides of that. It's what the content is that you have within what you're marketing, but also how people are accessing it as well. I hope that was helpful. Nathan, I don't know if you've got thoughts to share on that as well.
Yeah, just a couple. I think thinking about, because often it's difficult to know where you're perhaps going wrong with language when it comes to cultural sensitivity if you're simply just not aware of something, right? And so it really pays off when you do have a diverse team to begin with. Oftentimes that isn't the case. And so what you might want to do, and what I've seen some organizations do, is work with, I guess, there may be individual consultants, there may be activists, there may be people who are sort of knowledgeable in different aspects of diversity. And these can be almost like, I guess, a board, like an advisory board or something, or just a group of people who are likely to have the answers, who you can sense check things with. So, those cultural sensitivity checks, is this the right language that we should be using? Could you suggest any other language? And so that might be a way to approach it. I think definitely having some sort of checklist process to make sure that you are doing research as well and reading around some of the language that you might use, or how, I don't know specifically, what you're marketing. But there are sort of some real examples of organizations that have got it completely wrong. So I guess what I'd say to begin with, right, is if you're thinking about reaching a new market, for example, so this is where we often see where mistakes are made, right? You're thinking about reaching a new market and, there's a lack of cultural sensitivity there, and so a mistake is made. That's a key moment to really ask as many questions as possible and seek support to understand, are we going about this the right way? And anything to do with wanting to target specific groups, I would say as well, which maybe is slightly different to a new market, but, wanting to market to certain groups of people or represent certain groups of people, you always want to check that you're doing that in a way that is appropriate and culturally sensitive. Yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you both. We have another question from, I believe Laura is actually Lynn. She asks, do you think organizations looking to approach DEI need a specific team or a person to drive this? Or should it be absorbed into the L&D strategy strategy/team that already exists? Nathan, do you want to answer that one first?
So about building out a EDI team. Sorry, I was reading another question while you were reading out that one. If you could just repeat it.
Absolutely. Or if Helen wants to go, if she heard it, but I can definitely repeat it again. Do you think organisations looking to approach DEI need a specific team or person to drive this? Or should it be absorbed into the L&D strategy/team that already exists? Helen, do you want to go first?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Helen.
Yeah, sure. So I think the key thing here is ownership. So I think as long as there are recognised people within the business that are driving the conversation and getting the right people across the organisation involved, then it doesn't, for me, it wouldn't matter, whether there was a specific team or whether it did sit within the L&D function, as long as there was the right amount of time and resource that was being allocated to driving it across the business. I think, so we've seen examples of it working well both ways. So as I just mentioned, Dunelma, one of our clients, and they've currently split out that function. And other organisations like Lotteland, who I mentioned, they're driving the DE&I conversation via the L&D team within their own organisation. So I think either way, as long as someone is owning the conversation and owning the actions and keeping control of how they want to see that vision developing within the business, then that's the key thing. Nathan, did you want to add?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think in larger organizations, and I've experienced this, I've worked in-house as a diversity and inclusion manager. I think larger organizations, especially global organizations, ideally need a dedicated team. But then what I would say is that how those teams operate needs to be as collaborative across the business as possible. And so, as Helen said, actions aren't simply going to sit within, so someone asked a question about marketing, right? Actions that relate to marketing aren't going to sit within a DEI function. They're going to belong to the marketing function, and the DEI function is there to guide, right? And provide that internal expertise. What is it that we should be doing, and provide that strategic voice. And so what I see with a lot of organizations, you have perhaps one or two EDI leads who are expected to literally be running around doing absolutely everything. And that's not a sustainable approach to this work. It definitely needs to be more strategic. And if you are going to create a role, it needs to sit at the most senior level possible, right? It needs to sit at C-suite level. And be a strategic role to influence across all functions within the organization.
Thanks. We are getting close to the end, but Becky has asked a very good question, and I think we should squeeze it in. So Becky asks, do you have any tips or thoughts on L&D's role in social mobility? How can we better support people from socially diverse backgrounds to progress in their careers? Helen, let's go to you first.
Yeah, well, this is probably quite a lengthy answer, so I'm going to try and keep it really short. I think that L&D has a problem in general with diversity, so not just thinking about a specific career here, but L&D as well in general. We need to think about mentorship. I think that's a good way to go. Recognizing, what. Again, coming back to the hiring process, the recruitment process, what people are missing from even applying to your roles in the first place, and then maybe you can think about that. But also, once people are within an organisation, mentoring them, providing the right information, giving your seat at the table to someone else in certain instances, and being an advocate for other people. I think that's probably a really quick answer. But Nathan, did you want to add to it?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to this, right? You've got the cultural side to what we view as sort of social economic background, which, you know, again, comes back to conversations around bias, microaggressions, and how we're addressing those issues. But then, of course, there are sort of very practical things you can do. Something that I read an article about recently was that it's often assumed that apprenticeship programs are designed and attract people from less privileged social economic backgrounds, when actually the majority of people benefiting from apprenticeship programs are people from more privileged social economic backgrounds. And so I was really sort of surprised to read about that, because of the language that we use, right, and sort of the assumptions that we make around programs like that. So what I would say is organizations need to be really intentional for programs. If, you know, social mobility is a huge sort of priority within your organization, you're aware of different challenges, think about some of the ways that you can ensure that the places that you're creating on programs, opportunities, are going to the groups that you're actually designing them for, or you'd want to sort of benefit from them the most. And so, yeah, that might mean allocating certain spaces to people from less privileged social economic backgrounds, and having a way, of course, of tracking and monitoring that data.
Thank you both. That was a really great session, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have for the questions. Thank you to Nathan and Helen for such a great session today. And thanks to all of you for joining us and getting involved in the Q&A, some really fantastic questions. If you didn't get your questions answered, our speakers will be happy for you to reach out to them on LinkedIn. Their details are available on the dashboard. And you'll also get a copy of the recording sent to you so that you can look over the presentation in more detail in your own time. But that's all we have time for. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.